Hi everyone, my name is Matt and welcome to another Hobby Hour tutorial. This is the first in a series of Eavy Metal Marines, painted in an old school 1990s style using my hybrid method with Citadel contrast paints. After cleaning and assembling the model, I kept the arms and backpack separate. I glued a paperclip in the backpack and stuck it into a cork. The arms are attached but not glued. I'll keep them there for the priming stage but remove them after to paint separately. I started out by spraying the model with a gray primer. I use this primer available from Ace Hardware, but any gray will work fine. I like this particular one because the color is nearly identical to the Citadel layer paint Dawnstone, so after the primer is dry, I can go in with some thinned down Dawnstone and touch up any spots where the primer missed. The next step is to airbrush some white from the sides and top. This is often called a zenithal style prime, though usually a zenithal prime starts with black. I tend to prefer a lighter and more subtle type of zenithal prime, so in this case I'm just using gray and white. You could just as easily do this with a can of white spray paint, but I find an airbrush leaves a finer, less grainy finish. Next we're going to mix a color for the base coat. Mixing paints might seem complicated, but don't let it intimidate you. A little time spent mixing now will actually save some time later on. I'm using a mix of about 4 parts Black Templar, 2 parts Leviadon blue, and 1 part Macragge blue. I tested out a few different recipes, and I wanted something that got me as close as possible to the end result with just one coat. Each paint is providing something here. Contrast paint is by nature transparent, which means that some of the base coat shows through. By adding some Leviadon blue to the mix, it's going to be a little bluer on the edges where the paint gets thinner and breaks away from the surface. The Macragge blue is adding a tiny bit of opacity, which means we'll get a smoother, more even coat on the more broad surfaces. When applying contrast paints, work in one section at a time. If you notice any of the paint pooling, soak it up with the brush before it dries. The goal here is an even coat, not too thick that it runs off, but also not too thin. After the first coat dried, I thinned down some of the base coat mix with equal parts water, and then I applied a thin glaze over any areas that looked a little spotty. The first color we're going to use is the Fang, and highlight all of the edges of the armor. A good rule of thumb for how wide to make the highlight is to make the thinnest line you can and then double it. That way you have space to add the finer highlights later. The reason I mixed some blue in with the Black Templar base coat was to make the color better relate to the highlight colors that would follow. Notice on the edges where the base coat is thinner, it has a bluish gray tone very similar to the Fang color. After all the edges are highlighted, thin down the paint into a milk-like consistency and apply a few thin glazes towards the top sections of some armor panels, and add a few dots to act as spot highlights. This is a good time to decide where your light source is coming from and place your highlights accordingly. I decided my light source will be coming from above and slightly to his left. Next we're going to use some Fenrisian gray and go over all the edges again, but concentrating most of the paint on the upward facing portions of the armor. I thinned the paint with about equal parts water, and there's barely any paint on the brush. The width of this line should be narrower than the first highlight. After the edge highlights, thin down the paint a little bit more and add a touch to the spot highlights. Finally, with some thinned down white paint, add a few highlights to the very edges and corners. A little bit goes a long way here, so be selective about where you place them. Next we'll use some Stormvermin fur to base coat the armor joints. Since these areas will be black just like the armor, I want to distinguish them in some way, so I'll give them warm highlights, which will contrast well against the cool colored armor. Next, apply some Black Templar to the joints. Keep it thin and avoid pooling. With the Black Templar shade dry, highlight the joints with Stormvermin fur. Then I mixed in some Vallejo Offwhite for the next highlights. I focused these highlights closer to the outside of the knee, where they will be more visible. Finally, I added tiny spot highlights with pure Offwhite. For the red, I'm using a mix of Flesh Terror's red with a small amount of Khorne red mixed in, about a 3-to-1 ratio. Just like with the armor, we're making the red mix a little more opaque to achieve a smoother end result. Notice the coat is a little streaky on top of the gun. Sometimes that happens, it's just the nature of transparent paints on flat surfaces. Just apply a second thin coat wherever it's needed. I wanted to make the red just a little bit darker, so I applied a shade all over with Carroburg Crimson and allowed it to dry. With the shade dry, apply a thin highlight to all the edges with Mephiston red. Next, highlight the red with an equal mix of Mephiston red and Tau light ochre. Then use some thinned Tau light ochre on the edges and corners. Now use some Runelord brass to base coat the gun details, the cables on the backpack, the chest icon, and the torso cables. With the Runelord brass dry, apply a thin shade with Darkoath flesh. Keep this shade thin to avoid any excessive pooling, and allow to dry. Finally, highlight the edges of the brass details with a mix of 3 parts Stormhost silver and 1 part Runelord brass. Next, thin down some black paint and use it to reinforce the shadows, as well as provide a hard edge between colors. I painted this around the brass parts of the eagle, the brass parts on the gun, and around the red areas of the gun. When painting a black line like this, you're bound to get spillover, so I like to try and control that spillover and have it go on an area I haven't base coated yet, rather than ruin a finished section. I'm angling the brush so I get a clean mark on the red side of the gun, and I'm not worried if some of the black spills onto the barrel, because I'll be painting that silver later. Next, I base coated the eagle, gem, and eyes with a very light gray. If you don't want to mix paint, Corax White from Games Workshop would be a pretty close match. I mix and bottle my own neutral grays, and this one is the lightest in my 10-step grayscale. I don't have an exact recipe for this one, but it's approximately 10 parts white to 1 part black. Next, I gave the silver areas a base coat of Iron Hand steel. Keep the paint thin and even, and apply a second coat if necessary. To shade the silver, I'm using a mix that I just call Armor Wash. I mixed up a bottle of it since I use it so often. It's 2 parts Nuln Oil and 1 part Agrax Earthshade. Paint this all over the silver, and in some areas, such as the blade, it can be effective to paint the wash directly where you want it. The brush will deposit more paint where it last touches the model, and if you have the right touch, you can create a gradation effect. I like to paint blades with each facet having a gradation in the opposite direction. It might not be very realistic, but it can look striking from a distance. Finally, highlight all the edges with Stormhost Silver. I went back in afterwards and painted some black into the gun barrel. Next, I painted all the rivets black and then painted them with Runelord brass, leaving a thin black line all the way around them. For the white areas, I wanted to shade with a neutral gray color. Apothecary white already has some opaque pigment mixed in it, so I won't need to add any, but the color is too blue, so I added an equal amount of Nuln Oil to adjust it. Then I diluted it with an equal part of contrast medium. I applied this mix to the eagle, and when that was dry, I applied a second coat next to the brass and in the center of each wing where the feathers overlap. After that shade was dry, I thinned some white paint and highlighted the edges. Contrast paints are great for painting gems. You just have to start with the lightest color and work your way darker. I began with an even layer of Bad Moon Yellow and allowed it to dry. Then I applied some Mantis Warrior's Green, leaving a thin crescent of yellow showing at the bottom. After that dried, I gave the top section another coat of Mantis Warrior's Green. Followed by some thinned Aeldari Emerald near the very top. Next I gave the gem a thin glaze of Bad Moon Yellow to tie all the layers together. I used Dorn Yellow and painted a very thin highlight at the bottom of the gem. Finally I added a dot of white at the top. Next I used some super glue and attached the arms, but I didn't attach the backpack yet. I want to paint the freehand on the shoulders first, and the backpack would get in the way. Now that the arms are attached, I gave the shoulders a few thin layers of the same light gray from earlier. Then I used the same shade mix from the eagle and gave the bottom half of each shoulder a couple thin glazes. Now for the freehand. I started by painting the number on the knee pad in a light gray. Roll the brush on your palette as you drag it back, and it will help make a very fine point. Vertical lines are the easiest to paint, so I like to turn the model as needed. That way I'm always painting with a downstroke. The crosses on the shoulders are a little trickier. Using a thinned dark gray, mark the center of the shoulder pad and 4 small guide marks about halfway between the center point and the edges. Connect these dots to make a small cross shape. Now, going above and to the side of the guide line, paint a diagonal line going down towards the center. Repeat for the other side. Connect the top of these lines to the top of the smaller line, and then fill in the shape. Then use some thinned black to fill in and darken the shape. It can be really tough to make all the edges and angles perfect on the first try, especially when painting geometric shapes, so don't be afraid to go back and forth between the icon color and the background color. As long as the paint is kept thin, you should have plenty of wiggle room to make adjustments without creating too much texture. With the icons painted, take some of the light gray and thin it down a lot. Wipe almost all the paint off the brush so it's just barely damp, and then apply a thin glaze near the top of the icon to highlight it. Finally, take some pure white and paint a thin line around the edges of the shoulder pad. The last step is basing, and I wanted to give this model a classic goblin green base. I start all my bases by painting a thin layer of wood glue on top. I find that wood glue gives a much stronger bond than PVA or white glue, and it's also waterproof once it dries. White glue will reactivate when you paint on top of it, and wood glue won't. Once the glue is applied, dip it into a container of fine sand and shake off the excess. Give it a couple hours to dry. For a true goblin green base, we need some of this stuff. I don't have very much left, so I decided to mix an exact match from new paints. This mix is mostly Caliban green and Averland sunset, and if I remember right, a little bit of Warpstone glow and white too. If you don't want to mix anything, Warboss green is a close match, but doesn't have great coverage. You'll probably have to do 2 or 3 coats with it. Finally, apply a light dry brush with a bright yellow, such as Yriel yellow. And there we have it, a finished Black Templar Marine in all of his classic glory. Stay tuned as we continue the series in the following weeks. I have a bunch of old 2nd edition Marines in my collection and they're ready for paint. What classic Space Marine chapter would you like to see next? Thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, please drop a like down below, and don't forget to subscribe. I have a lot of new content in the works. So, until next time, happy painting.